Welcome to our podcast. I'm Ed, and I was joined by Kate, Payton, and Santi, and we did a podcast on school segregation in Boston. Tune in and enjoy.
So why did we pick this topic?
But we just thought it was like a very, it's like an overlooked topic, and it's happening in a school or in a city that we're all going to be going to school at. And we just thought it was important for like the general population to know about because it's like not very known.
Yeah,
It's always it's overlooked a lot.
and it's crazy because like you think of Boston as so progressive, you kind of forget that we have that dark history too.
Yeah, it seems like it seems like something that we definitely should have outgrown. Like it shouldn't exist anymore.
Mhm.
And it's like kind of like disturbing that it does still exist.
Santi, do you want to start by talking about what you kind of found throughout?
Sure. Well, basically, when you look at the background of this, the segregation of schools really was an issue mostly in the South, which, I mean, in a way you would expect, right? Because those were the Confederate States and, all their history and background. So truly seeing this, especially since, what was it, like it was 1870 when the first segregated school in the North was founded in DC. To me, that was pretty shocking because, it was the North, the Union. You wouldn't expect that. But, I really thought that seeing that in that time period wasn't as shocking as seeing the remnants of it now. And, I found a lot of statistics that speak about the specific groups, ethnic groups that are segregated in the Boston area and their historic background of how either their segregation has gone up or down. And for the most part, it's actually gone up.
Really?
Yes, that was pretty surprising to me.
Over what time period?
From 1960, so the Civil Rights Movement, to early 2000s. Turns out that for African Americans, it has gone a bit better. It's gone down by 1.2%. But for Hispanics and Asians, it's actually increased from 5% in 1963 for Hispanics to 6.6% in the modern day, and 2.7% for Asians into 4.7%.
I still feel like even for African Americans, like it went down, but 1.2% is like not enough for it to have gone down. It definitely should have gone down much more than that.
Absolutely, I agree.
Kate, you did a lot of research on de facto segregation. What was that really about? Because in my research about Boston specifically, they said that was the type that was going on.
So I looked into like a specific school system that where de facto segregation took place, and it was about a school in Alabama. It was in a town called Gardendale, and they had a majority white population, and they're like neighboring Birmingham, which has a majority black population. And so all of those schools went to the same school district. They all had the same school system. But Gardendale, like their community, like wanted to like secede from the school system and then make their own school system, which would have been made up of like primarily like a white rich population, which is what like Gardendale's population was. And it was basically just about how like the like they were able to, like law like allowed them to do that. And so it created just like, so one school was left being like majority Black, poor population, and one school was majority white and like wealthy, and that's what like de jure segregation was. So it was like
Yeah.
it wasn't like they were like purposely like saying they couldn't go there, but because they took themselves out of the school system and made their own, it like forced segregation to occur.
Hmm.
Right.
I found that as well in my research a lot. What I looked into was basically the battle between the NAACP and the Boston School Committee. And like what had really happened was the Boston School Committee would put out statements and things that made it seem like they were trying to desegregate schools and stuff like that and change things around, but that like their underlying intent was still to keep schools segregated, and they had the support from the like general public. And there was like multiple laws passed and multiple meetings and restrictions that were made over the years to like get control over the schools and let the like school committee have less control. But a big part of it was the busing laws and changing those up, and like changing how the like lines for what school you could go to were. And when that started to happen, there was real progress, but it took a lot of policies and laws and just like restrictions on the school committee, not necessarily like laws in general that desegregated schools, to actually have progress. Like it took a lot more than just one law to be passed to let schools become desegregated, or what was perceived as desegregated, because what Payton got into was kind of how it still is segregated, if you want to talk about that.
Right. So I actually looked on the Boston Public Schools website itself because I wanted to see what they were saying, that they claim about like having diversity in their schools. And they actually said that they're proud to be one of the most diverse schools in the district's nation. That every two students speaks a different language other than English at home, and come from like 139 different countries. But then I read deeper into like some other articles, and one in particular by the Boston Globe was saying how um, nearly 60% of the city schools meet the definition of being intensely segregated. And 60% is way more than just like, I don't know, just like a 10% or something like that. Like that's a good amount of Boston schools like claiming to have segregation of some kind, whether it's like fully, you know, like African American populated schools or white student schools. Basically what it was trying to say is that that still exists today, and it's not as intense as like Jim Crow South, where only Black students could use this and only white students could use that. It's more just like where African American students or white students grew up is where they go to school, and that's the type of like segregation that's happening today. It's not as drastic, but it still exists, and it's kind of a reflection of what happened in the past. It's kind of just like that original sin of like slavery and racism building into a new kind of racism today. And that's something that's huge right now in the media with Black Lives Matter as well. And that's coming more to our attention today. And it really just like school segregation is one of the biggest like forms of racism that there is. And it's actually looked, like we were saying before, looked over more than anything. You don't hear about it as much.
Yeah.
It's like extremely segregated.
It's almost like the foundation of a lot of the problems we see, because you go to a different school, you don't get the same education, the same opportunities, and the next thing you know, you're already starting at a disadvantage. And like that was kind of the real reason we got into this topic, is because like we kind of wanted to get to the core issue of what's going on today, you know? And like that was the context of this project. And like not core issue, there's a lot of issues, but this was this is a reason why it's even harder to move forward, you know?
Exactly.
Word.
It's not
Wait,
like
but I said de jure segregation is not. It was de facto.
It's fine. We could go back and like you could
And
literally
there's also like a ton of stats for mine that like make it just sound better.
just drop them. Just drop them now. Like you
Drop
could,
'em,
this could
drop
keep being the podcast.
Okay. So Gardendale's Gardendale has a white population of about 88%, while Birmingham's black population is about 75%. And Gardendale is a part of the Jefferson County school system, which has a black student enrollment of about 44%. And as a city, Gardendale requested federal approval to separate themselves and set up their own school district. So because Gardendale created their own school system and they are a mostly white population, the school system will be made up of mostly white students. So the separation of the schools resulted in de facto segregation because a majority of one race was living in one area. So they all the students that lived in Gardendale, and which was a majority white students, would go to Gardendale, and then the remaining students that were left at Jefferson County, most of them would be black students. So it wasn't like they weren't doing it on purpose. Like they weren't saying they weren't allowed to be in the school system, but it just
That was a
created segregation.
Sorry. That was a big part of my research where they when they started busing, that was when they started integrating those populations and like the bus rides were, this is where it got dicey because they were making black and other minorities getting bused into white communities, you know, and like having that long bus ride to school, but to integrate the schools. And then that's where like more racism came into play because it's like, oh, why do the white kids just get to go where they live, and then we all have to go to their school, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
that is an interesting point.
yeah, I found the same thing. But tying back to something that Payton said about, I think it was public schools in Boston, that they're very diverse. In my research, they speak on that, and how, as a matter of fact, most white kids that live downtown Boston, are actually attending private schools rather than public schools, and how that may vary statistics about diversity in public schools or even in their own private schools.
That's it for the podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed and learned something from our conversation. Peace.